Conventional wisdom is a phrase you're likely to stumble across a lot when it comes to principles of good design in any medium, but it's a problematic term which can do more to hamper quality than amplify it. Conventional wisdom cannot be applied in a vacuum without a clear purpose. For design principles, those principles aren't any good, right? This is something I spent a lot of my time playing Kingsfield 1 thinking about, because it's a game which grinds very hard against what one might expect from a game of this era, and yet the experience really hit home for me. The expanded Kingsfield license is one which has never gotten a blockbuster reception, and it might be because of how fringe some of its sensibilities were. Demon's Souls would take this brand of game and slightly tune it to go down better with people, but in that translation, something was definitely lost, and in this video, we'll be talking about what that was. Hi, I'm AesirAesthetics, and in this video, we'll be going over Kingsfield in depth. If you're not at all familiar with the game, I'd recommend playing it yourself if you can get it running. It was never released outside of Japan, so the only way for you to play through it in English is to download the fan-translated emulation and go through the hurdles of installing BIOS and such. If you've done that, or if that sounds like too much of a hassle, grab yourself a cup of coffee and strap in, as we take a look back at Kingsfield 1. The history of Kingsfield 1 is the history of FromSoftware. The FromSoftware of yesteryear. The one prior to the Miyazaki ascendancy and to their meticulously crafted niche adventure and action games of the late 90s, early 2000s, but the history of FromSoftware nonetheless. It was founded in the 1980s as an office software developer, but changed course in the 1990s and branched out into video games. This is the origin story, kids, the game that started the ball rolling. And what sparked this course redirection was the very game you're looking at right now. Surprise! This isn't a spreadsheet manager designed by Satan, it's actually wizardry for the Apple II, and it was wizardry that inspired FromSoftware to attempt a PC action game about 3D robots navigating an underground labyrinth, and what do you know? Some of this idea would eventually make its way to Kingsfield, which launched 4 years later on the PlayStation 1. 4 years later because, according to FromSoft, PCs at the time wouldn't dependably handle the project as initially planned, and PlayStation, assumably because they wanted to develop for the revolutionary CDs. What launched was a mixed at best reviewed game, but as Demon's Souls would do a mere 15 years later, Kingsfield garnered a cult following, and the sales number eventually grew to justify the continuation of the franchise. Interestingly though, as poorly as some components of this game have aged, I'm finding that nothing about it has aged worse than the general reviews it got. After sifting through the wishy-washy jargon, the general review of the game at launch seems to me to be that it nailed certain parts of the landing but was unfocused to a fault and best appreciated for its dispersed chunks. The music, the level design, etc. This is ridiculous to me because the one thing I think it did nail without question is the fundamentals. It's an incredibly well executed dungeon crawler which absolutely nailed the landing for me. It may have tried some not so great flips while in the air, but the landing was solid. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of playing, however, let's briefly talk about the game's story. Kingsfield's story is minimalistic to say the least, where Dark Souls would generously, comparatively, be told through item descriptions. Kingsfield is mostly told through vague hintings in its manual, and it reads, "Once there was a small country named Verdite which was surrounded on all sides by a deep forest. In ancient days there was a great war here, many people died, and there was great destruction, but finally a hero arose who saved Verdite. Whether this savior was a person, a fairy or a monster, it quickly disappeared into the fog which drifts through the forest. This being came to be known as the Dragon of the Forest, and a sanctuary was built to honor it, and the builders passed on the story. Eventually, only the legend remained, and the sanctuary was turned into the royal family's graveyard, and all was quiet. The legend says, one day, the Dragon of the Forest will return, bringing magical artifacts, although for now, the sanctuary remains silent. Once, a certain clan and its leader visited the sanctuary and used magic power to take rule over the country, making their leader king. It was they who started to build the royal cemetery in the sanctuary. As the graveyard became bigger and bigger, it seemed that the king might be searching for the magical artifacts of legend. In fact, that may be why he and his people came in the first place. John Alfred Forrester was born the eldest son of Hauser, commander of the Royal Guard. He became interested in the art of sword fighting and started training. It seemed he might have a skill that could even surpass his father's. Hoping to exceed his father, John set out for a neighboring country to study under his father's friend, and so one day, while working on his technique, John heard rumors about his home. The king often sent soldiers to search for the magic artifacts, but no matter how hard they searched, they never found them. Finally, the soldiers didn't come back at all, so another force was sent to investigate. It turned out that monsters had appeared in the graveyard and were attacking the soldiers. The king ordered Commander Hauser to lead a large force and regain control, but they were massacred and almost completely destroyed. So the king spread word across his kingdom and neighboring countries, offering a bounty for exterminating the remaining monsters and trying to recruit mercenaries. Concerned for his father's safety, John returned home to find that Commander Forrester had returned after leading the attack, but then went back to the graveyard to rescue his men. John decided to enlist as a mercenary and go to the graveyard to search for his father. This is all that the game manual told me, but there's also the Verdite Chronicle to consider. It launched a bit later, and it recontextualizes a lot of the experience here to be a cohesive narrative. It's not unfaithful to the game's happening, but it's a lot more, he struck the harp to reveal a bridge, and a lot less, he retread the same area 12 times to find a secret entrance which had some barrels which had some healing grass. I'll sprinkle over the video some notable paragraphs from it going forwards, but before I do, I want to note that in spite of being generous, the retelling really does capture the tone of the story. Kingsfield is bleak, and it revels in conventional fantasy tropes wherever it can. It's really strange to see just how straight this game actually plays the fantasy, because I just don't see that anymore. When I think of a modern fantasy story, I always think of some sort of politically motivated or dark ethic story which uses fantasy tropes as a medium. But Kingsfield is just straight up fantasy, and that is really refreshing. You meet a fairy and a dragon, and there are no strings attached. You fight monsters, and the game expects you to buy into the fantasy tradition of nobility. John Alfred Forrester is crowned king by the end because he saved the land, and isn't that just delightful? I was so ready for this game's ending to explain to me that human beings are rotten and that their existence is a crime upon the natural flow of the world, yada yada yada. No. The game has a happy ending. Go figure. The wholesome end of the story, the strict adherence to fantasy convention and resolution of the plot all came as a happy surprise to me, but I think that this can largely be attributed to my expectations going in. If I had played the game in 1994, I might have fully expected what I got. However, this was only the second biggest surprise I encountered in my playthrough. The biggest was the gameplay, because I thought I was in for an antiquated mess. little did I know that Kingsfield, in spite of what you may think from what you're looking at here, completely worked for me 26 years after its original release. Right, so the game takes place in a graveyard composed of 5 levels. Each one goes deeper and keeps more regal people, starting at the commoners on the top floor and going through knights and nobility until you eventually reach the burial of kings. The graveyard setting lends itself really well to a gradual descent, and the levels get older and more evil the deeper down you go and get closer to the main antagonist of the game, the Dark Wizard. As a location, it gets a gold star from me. It seeps of death and is a very good delivery method. Since each level is older, each level answers some of the mysteries of the previous levels and introduces new ones for deeper levels to solve. And the deeper we descend, the more the game starts to lean on its fantasy setting for spectacle, with legends which you may have vaguely heard about or read on the upper floors being actually made manifest on the lower floors. It gives you a real sense of growth when you go from reading about a legendary dragon on the upper levels to receiving its blessings on the bottom. It's a rewarding journey, but it's not gonna work if you don't force yourself to focus in the early game. The first thing you'll see when you start playing is a brief text scroll which fills you in on the lore of the game, and it's about the most storytelling this game does in that short amount of time. After that, you get to the game, and immediately there are 3 major hurdles that I think people will have to enjoying the game, and all are apparent in the first minute. Hurdle 1, this game's visuals have not aged well. Hurdle 2, movement is very slow, and Hurdle 3, combat is very clunky. For Hurdle 1, I can't really describe an antidote. Unfortunately, this is just one of those things, you're either going to be able to look at walls textured with very boring images, or you're not. And unimaginative enemy models are either going to turn you off, or they're not. Fortunately for me, I have a lot of affinity for this era's visual limitations, where everything 3D looked borderline hallucinogenic, with enemies made of basic shapes and walls so jittery that it looked like the world was held together with duct tape. What I will say, and this is what I think can save the game, is that the experience as a whole makes up for its inadequacies, and that's true of the visuals. And of course there's the whole general desensitization thing, which every game has. Once you've been playing for 30 minutes, you kinda read the game's visuals as a real place, not so much as just simple geometry anymore. Hurdle 2 was the slow movement, and I actually think I can fix this, because I think this is mostly a perception issue. This game is such a PlayStation 1 exclusive that it was one of the very first games that ever launched for that console. But that means movement obviously isn't going to be as refined as it is in modern games. See, Kingsfield 1 is mapped to the DualShock 1 controller, and that controller didn't have any joysticks, so there's no looking around freely. Instead, you have the D-pad, which handles moving forwards and backwards as well as turning to the left and right. The R1 and L1 button handle strafing, and R2 and L2 are used to look up and down. First things first, R1 and L1 should have been used to turn, and the D-pad should have been solely used to move the guy. Second thing, the slow movement is mostly a perception issue, is caused by the turn speed, not the game's movement speed. The guy's movement speed is perfectly fine. There's no running allowed like there would be next time, which kinda sucks, but it's not like you'll be crawling around the map. The only issue is that turning the camera is very slow. You can turn on the spot and all that, but when you're playing, you're not gonna do that. You're going to be predicting where you'll need to face a new direction, and you'll start doing so a bit before the turn to save time, and because of this, in a way, John Alfred Forster moves A lot less like a nimble knight and a lot more like a car. On a handful of occasions, I think this turning speed worked to the game's advantage, but I feel that was mostly down to accident, not so much intentional design. There are times where we enter a room and all of a sudden find ourselves in combat with enemies we need to turn around to see. Those moments make the player a bit more cautious moving around, but since enemies patrol areas regardless of being aware of the player, this can be mitigated by just waiting a second or two before entering a room. The enemy will likely walk in front of the player, and the only real upside which I find the slow turn speed has is mostly done away with. The final hurdle I noted was the clunky combat, and here I don't think there's a lot to say. I think the combat is totally fine. The more valid criticism is that if you don't understand it, then it can come across as very clunky, because it's not super intuitive. Looking at it, you might think this has aged poorly, but aside from the animations, I think this system could be brought back without any change and modern gamers would eat it up. This system is basically what the Elder Scrolls or Dark Souls do now, except it's got fewer weapons, fewer spells, has the shield play into armor defense rather than be an item to be used in combat, it has less stat metagaming, and it's kinda crazier with how it handles stamina. So, a conventional action game's stamina bar, if it has one, will have each blow eat a bit of stamina, which then slowly regenerates. Simple enough. Kingsfield does this wonderful thing where you have endless stamina and can always attack, but you have a power bar, and that makes all the difference. When you attack, the power bar drops to 0, and depending on how heavy your equipped weapon is, the slower the power bar will regenerate. And the higher the power bar is when you attack, the more damage you do. Combat here has a built-in mechanism to force the player to dance around the enemies a bit. Just because they're open for an attack doesn't mean that they should be attacked. But if the player is low on health, maybe they take every opportunity to deal damage and never dish out their full power. After playing with this system for a while, I've grown to really like this alternative universe take on stamina systems, which seems to be more in keeping with cooldowns from JRPGs than 3D action games. Transcending both conventions, however, Kingsfield never kills you with inactivity. You're never in a situation where you cannot make a move. It's a bit disappointing, I'll acknowledge that the power and magic bars don't play into any other aspects of the game, which conventional stamina systems often do, so it doesn't really guide the experience out of battle, but if all it had to do was make combat engaging, then I think it's doing its job, and I feel it still holds up, maybe with the exception of enemies. See, enemies all work the same. They have an attack animation which you need to move away from, and then they're open for an attack, but they don't telegraph themselves super well, so the player is gonna get hit by some cheap attacks, and when the enemies get magic attacks, it kinda starts to feel like the game's a bit unfair with how short their cooldowns seem to be, but I think the developers were aware of this, which is why there's so many ways to get healing items. They're found in abundance on the map, they're dropped by a lot of enemies, they're sold very cheap, and among the game's very first quests is to retrieve the Dragon Cup, which activates a fountain that'll fully rejuvenate you whenever you drink from it. I don't know if this is the case, but at times the low price of healing, to me, felt like a concession on the developer's side, an acknowledgement that, yeah, there's some shade to be cast on the combat's quote-unquote fairness, but this didn't really matter to me in the great scheme of things. Like I've said, I think the combat plays fine, and if we want to be generous, we might even say that the poorly telegraphed animations make resource management more eminent in the early game. If every enemy was completely fair, a perceptive player could largely ignore their inventory, but because they aren't. It guides a lot of the experience for the first few levels. Then we get healing spells and regenerating mana, and will be rich enough to never really hurt for resources, but in those early levels, the resources demand a lot of attention. Remember, this is a PlayStation 1 exclusive, so there's no saves coming our way to victory here. We save at designated save points on the map, which long-time subscribers will know I have a lot of affinity for, and the paths between those save point areas are dangerous and often filled with traps. The traps are pretty obvious, but their existence still forces the player to go through the areas slowly. Enemies are interesting here because while eminently defeatable, their aforementioned cheapness makes every engagement more of a liability than maybe we'd like. And so we might want to run past them, which is a completely viable strategy, so long as you don't mind being underleveled going forwards. The game kind of expects the player to fight everything they see, and that really eats into their resources. Since I am, famously, the only man on Earth who prefers Demon Souls' grass healing over Dark Souls' Estus, direct your hate in the comment sections, I was delighted by the way this game deals with health. Until the economy got out of whack, but by that point, I didn't even care. For a first-time playthrough, there's really no knowing when you'll be able to buy more healing items, and drop rates are not consistent enough to rely solely on them. So moving between areas requires a serious consideration as to whether or not we'll be able to survive. And the thing is, there's no second guessing here. The Fog of War makes every step such a liability because enemies are unseen basically up until the point they're right in front of you, and when you move far enough away from their corpses, dead enemies respawn. So there's a liability to advancing and retreating. This almost made the game perfectly cruel, but the levels are a bit too wide. You definitely can just walk around most of the enemies when retreating. Probably the levels would play better if they'd funnel the player a bit to dedicate the scarce resources into fighting respawned enemies again, but let's not nitpick too hard. I'm trying to be positive here. For me, the early portion of this game was spent constantly retreating back to save points and gradually advancing further into each area. Things got easier when I found the map and was able to more consistently navigate, but the core gameplay loop wasn't really disturbed by this discovery. It's just that I finally had some data to draw on as I made my bets. And something I found very interesting was that level progression wasn't actually solely tied to items or keys. It would become that way, but the first level can be descended right off the bat. There's a passageway with an arrow trap, and you can either shut those arrows off in advance, you can level yourself up enough to survive the hits, effectively tanking your way forwards, or you can just time your movement and not be hit by the arrows at all. Advancing through the game at times makes it feel like navigating an early attempt at a 3D Metroidvania, collecting items and keys which unlock more of the map and reward going back to previous areas. The harp raises bridges, the phantom rods let us see through hidden walls, and if the exploration had been a bit more insistent on the player returning to previous areas, then maybe this game's legacy would be that of an early Metroidvania, but that stuff is mostly for optional gain. Excessively experimenting with the levels has made it painfully obvious to me that the game can be completed with the wall hug strategy, but advancing through the world and uncovering the story is still a satisfying adventure. The way this dungeon crawler works is that you find sigils on the ground, and stepping on them warps the player to another level. And finding these is essentially what the game is about. Characters in this game are mostly for tone setting and item acquisition. They fill the player in on the story to some extent, but their utility is mostly contained to exuding dread. But it's worth noting that the game's happy ending is set up appropriately in the early game, and if we take what we learned from the Verdite Chronicle and apply it, even more so. The Verdite Chronicle explains that our protagonist is the descendant of an evil, magical bloodline, but his mother was far enough removed that she didn't have any of the evil, but had the magic, and our dude was born a hero of light. Before coming to the island, he had a strange experience where a voice awoke him in the night and lured him into the forest. He was given a seemingly divine blessing and told to fulfill his destiny, which is when he decided to come to the graveyard. He learns from beleaguered soldiers here that his father, although he had returned, had gone missing when he went back into the graveyard to save his men. Something I should note about the game's quests is that they are all very transient. The game really doesn't feel like it's excessively directed. For example, there's no quest log which collects quests, and you don't always know if you even got a quest or if you just had a conversation with somebody. But it all implores the player to explore, which eventually gets them to the level sigils, which advances their game's progress. The acquisition of the first map isn't actually a quest, even. You can find it near the boy's corpse without ever talking to his father. Likewise, you can get the cross for the priest without him asking you to do so. The Verdite Chronicle posits that John Alfred Forrester found a dragon crystal, which in-game cures all ailments and refills all stats, and gave it to Heinz in exchange for his magical heart. But in-game, you can actually just buy those fruits and do the trade. Characters talk to the player about how they may or may not be powerful enough to face the Dark Wizard, and the wizard himself remarks that John's father was a mighty warrior since he was able to slay the Black Knight, but that stuff might have no meaning to you when you're playing, because you're not guaranteed to find the whole story of your father's grave, let alone know that that's what you're looking at when you see it. Regardless of how much of a lore whore you are, you'll need to interact with these characters to advance, and doing so will have you go through depraved and depressed stories. There's no missed opportunity to hammer home the game's dark atmosphere, and what shocked me in my second playthrough was that what is arguably the story's most important quest is actually optional. And that's the quest for the Moonlight Sword. And, also some of the more other useful items in the game, like the green dragon rod, which acts as the game's homeward bone, teleporting you back to the starting location of a level, which saves so much time and lets you cheese out of danger if, that's what you want to do. The sword itself is found on the 4th floor, but doesn't actually appear until the end of the game. On the 4th floor, you find a stone sword named the Dragon Sword. But then, on the 5th floor, we can find the dragon of the game's legend, and the fairy which gave us the green dragon rod will appear to lift the magical curse off the dragon sword and reveal it for the Moonlight Sword. This curse was apparently placed on the sword to hide it from the Dark Wizard, and when we get this thing, the game becomes a real breeze. Power and magic regeneration both become almost instantaneous, and the damage this thing deals is off the charts. After acquiring it, the sealed doors on each level are all unlocked, and the most powerful armor set in the game is finally lootable within them. This being optional is very interesting to me, because when I found this stuff, it felt like I was beating the game for the first time again. It made the deeper exploration that much more rewarding, and if satisfying exploration isn't a cornerstone of a good dungeon crawler, then I don't know what is. A lot of the game is contained within the conventions and limitations of its era, and it was really fun to witness that stuff. The final level felt like the end of System Shock or Silent Hill, where all of a sudden you move from a generally nightmarish setting straight into a hellscape with enemies who are so much more powerful than anything before them that it doesn't even feel like you're meant to fight them. Enemies drop nothing, so you're reliant on the prep work you did to get to that level, and if you don't survive, you're going to have to redo that 20-minute set piece. The final gauntlet feels like it was meant to be run through, and the end, where John meets the Dark Wizard. Mwah. I mean, just look at this thing. This is what video game bosses used to look like, and what on earth am I looking at? Conceptually, this boss is such nonsense that it's just great. It's a tentacle tree monster with a giant white mask for a face which shoots explosions and spawns enemies. It's like they were trying to design an enemy which didn't make sense, and I think it totally works. I know I'm gushing over what might in reality be a hastily modeled tree enemy, but I don't know, something about this design really works for me. And that might actually be my thoughts on the game as a whole. I know it hasn't aged perfectly. I know there are quote-unquote conventionally better games from that era. I've covered some of them on this very channel. But there's something about the way this game comes together which really hits home for me. I like the happy fantasy story ending where John, after defeating the evil, is crowned the new king of Verdite. I like how much of modern FromSoftware's sensibilities are apparent here, and having played Kingsfield 2 and 3 at the point of this recording, I can wholeheartedly say that the subsequent games only got better. Replaying Kingsfield 1 after playing those, this game really screams great bedrock, and I couldn't get enough. The visuals have aged terribly, the combat is clunky, the map, great at the time since it wasn't grid-based, has become kind of a joke. But ignore the haters, the cumulative experience of Kingsfield 1 still totally works. It's still an incredibly well-executed dungeon crawler, and although you can nitpick individual aspects of the experience, as a whole I feel it's aged incredibly well. Like I said earlier, I disagree with the reviews from 1994 because I think that the fundamentals are what this game got right, and I think the best testament to this is the rich legacy it spawned. One of the things which made these Souls games so refreshing from a gameplay perspective was that they brought the dungeon crawler sensibilities out of the dungeon. It was immensely satisfying to see where Miyazaki got his style from, and it was also satisfying to see how much of Kingsfield lives on in the modern FromSoftware. If Kingsfield was the bedrock, then it was the Soul series which took what had been fermenting in that dungeon for so long and brought it into a larger, more environmentally diverse world. But the creative genius behind the philosophies which made those games was actually evident as early as 1994. It just lacked some refinement, and in some cases, that lack of refinement was to the game's great benefit. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe for more like it, as well as browse around this channel to see if there's anything else that piques your interest. You might enjoy my Demon Souls videos, and if you're visiting from the future, you might also enjoy the subsequent Kingsfield videos I made, if I followed through and made them. I'm riding on kind of a Kingsfield high right now and really want to cover all of them, but you know how these things work. You lose interest, or you put something aside for a week, and then it's been a year, and yeah. I'm still operating this channel on the bi-monthly release schedule, where every month I switch from making YouTube videos and making my video game. Last month I spent some time making assets for a swamp level, as well as overhauling the movement to allow my guy to roll around and use a bow. The animations aren't great yet, but they're good enough to playtest with, and making the swamp level itself has definitely taught me some lessons, like don't make too big levels again. For more frequent updates on the channels happening, I'd recommend subscribing, as well as listening to the Essays&Espresso podcast. The Kingsfield 1 translation was done by John Osborne, who's owed many thanks from me. The footage I used in this video was supplied by channel favorite WorldofLongplays, as played by Deskawa, who are linked below. Also linked below is my Patreon, where I give early access to videos to members. So if you want to stay ahead, chuck in as little as $1. I like making these videos sponsorship free. I actually rejected a $400 Raid Shadow Legends offer, which was made for this video, but these videos still take a lot of time to make, and any financial support means I can buy myself that extra bit of free time to devote to them. I hope this video was worth the time you spent watching it. For the rest of May, I'll be getting back to work on Project BB, working title for my game, and then I'll get back to working on some videos for you guys in June. I'll cover Kingsfield 2, hopefully, and something else which I haven't quite decided yet. Maybe Thief, or Deus Ex, or something. For the past few weeks, I've been teasing that I was working on a secret video to launch alongside my Kingsfield analysis, and this seems like as good a time as any to give you all a little preview of what's to come. I'm AesirAesthetics, and until next time, take care.